The folding chair had arrived 3 weeks late. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked into the council chamber for the very first time. Every other species had seats that were carved, bolted, grown, or crystallized directly into the tiered gallery of that enormous room. The Keth Dominion had thrones of compressed dark matter that hummed at a frequency you felt in your back teeth. The Vethani delegation sat on something that looked like frozen smoke and somehow held their weight. The Orisi had what appeared to be living coral formations, shaped to cradle their four-part spinal columns. And then there was me, Yale Akoi Marsh, ambassador of Earth, sitting in a chair that the council's logistics department had shipped separately, in a crate labeled Supplementary Furnishing Minor Delegation, which had been held up at the station's intake dock because no one had thought to assign Earth a dock number. They gave us one eventually. Dock 119C, the same dock used for supply shipments and maintenance equipment. I sat in my chair, and I did not let my face do anything at all. The chamber itself was built inside a hollowed moon. That is not a metaphor. The Galactic Council had taken an actual moon, emptied it over the course of about 2 centuries, smoothed the interior into a perfect sphere, and then carved 7 kilometers of tiered seating into the inner walls. The ceiling was the moon's far side, which they had thinned to translucency so that starlight came through in long, pale columns. It was, I will admit, one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen in my life. It was also designed, in every structural and procedural detail, to make certain species feel like furniture. There were 41 member species in the Galactic Council at that point. Humanity had been admitted 14 months earlier, after a review process that had taken 22 years and required 3 separate votes because the first 2 were deemed procedurally insufficient. The admission had passed on the 3rd vote by a margin of 2. I had read the transcript of that vote on the transport ride over. The debate had lasted 9 hours. A delegate from the Orisi Continuum had argued that humanity's pattern of resource overconsumption relative to technological maturity was a structural risk to galactic stability. The Keth lead advocate had seconded that concern. They had admitted us anyway, not because they believed in us, because the vote math worked out and there was a procedural deadline they did not want to miss. I knew all of this before I sat down in my late-arriving chair. My protocol handler was a Vethani named S. Sarrel. The Vethani were tall, narrow-shouldered creatures with semi-translucent skin through which you could see the faint movement of their circulatory system, pale blue and slow. They communicated in 2 registers simultaneously, spoken language and a complex system of fin movements along their jaw and collar that carried emotional and tonal content the spoken words left out. Learning to read the fins was not part of any standard diplomatic training package. I had spent 4 months learning anyway. S. Sarrel found me in the gallery corridor before the first session opened. His fins moved in a slow, flattened pattern I had catalogued as bureaucratic resignation, the Vethani equivalent of someone sighing before they explain something obvious to someone they do not expect to understand it. "Ambassador Akoi Marsh," he said, "I have been assigned to assist your delegation with procedural orientation." "I appreciate that," I said. "The Council operates on a seniority-weighted participation model," he said. "Species admitted within the last 50 years are extended observer status with limited floor access. You may submit written queries through the Tier 4 filing system. Response times average between 30 and 90 standard days. And verbal participation." The fins shifted, something between amusement and pity. "You will not be addressed in session," he said. "It is not protocol." "I understand the protocol," I said. He looked at me for a moment with the particular stillness of someone who has just realized the person they are talking to did not find that discouraging and is not sure what to do with that. "The first session begins in 40 minutes, he said. "The primary item on the agenda is a resource reallocation bill submitted by the Keth Dominion." He handed me a data tablet and walked away. The fins, as he turned, made a movement I had not catalogued before, something small and quick. I filed it away. I sat back down in my chair and opened the bill. It was 412 pages long. The Keth Dominion's Resource Realignment and Sustainable Development Act, version 7, revision 4. The language was dense, careful, and precise in the way that very well-designed traps are precise. On the surface, it was an environmental management framework. It cited 17 geological surveys, 4 pan-galactic ecological indices, and a landmark ruling from 340 years ago that had established mineral extraction quotas in the outer belt regions. On the surface, I read it straight through. The session started. Speakers rose and spoke in languages my earpiece translated with a half-second delay. I kept reading. My coffee went cold. A Keth delegate delivered a 40-minute presentation with holographic mapping overlays that made the bill look like conservation work. I kept reading. The chamber around me voted on a secondary agenda item. Voted again. The light through the thin ceiling shifted as the station moved through its orbital position. My coffee was cold enough now that I stopped noticing it was there. And then I found it. Subsection 7, Appendix C footnote 19. It was 11 lines long. It was written in a subordinate clause construction that made it read like an administrative clarification rather than a substantive provision. It redefined the threshold criteria for biological sustainability review in a way that quietly, technically, and completely legally excluded any species admitted within the last 30 standard years from the asteroid belt claim protections that the main body of the bill was pretending to guarantee. 4 species fell inside that window. Earth was one of them. I closed the data tablet. I set it down on my knee with care. The chamber continued around me, enormous and humming with the procedural machinery of 11 civilizations that had been doing this for longer than humanity had had written language. I looked at my cold coffee. Then I looked at the 11 lines again. I had come here expecting to be furniture. That was fine. Furniture could be moved. Furniture could be rearranged. Furniture, if you were paying attention, told you everything about how a room was designed to work and who it was designed to work for. I had 412 pages of information now. I had one footnote that mattered. I had a session schedule showing the bill was moving to final vote in 9 days. 9 days was enough. I picked up my coffee, cold as it was, and drank it anyway. Then I opened a new file on my tablet and started writing. The chair was late. The dock number was borrowed from a maintenance bay. The vote that let us in had passed by 2. I had read every word of a 412-page document in a room where no one expected me to speak. 9 days. I started writing. The first thing I did the next morning was attend a subcommittee session that had nothing to do with the Keth bill. S. Sarrell found me there during the recess interval, standing in the back row of a gallery that held maybe 30 delegates and had clearly not expected a human in it at any point. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has shown up to a party that was not for them and does not seem to know that. This is the Infrastructure Subcommittee on Inner Belt Transit Corridors, he said. I know, I said. It is not relevant to Earth's current procedural standing. I'm curious about the process, I said. The Finns did the thing I had begun privately calling the resigned flutter. He left. I stayed. I attended 4 more sessions that day, a resource classification hearing, a dispute arbitration preliminary, a procedural review committee that spent 3 hours discussing the proper formatting requirements for Tier 2 filings. I took notes on all of it, not because any of it was directly useful, because I was starting to understand that the Council's power did not live in its votes. It lived in its procedures, and procedures, unlike power, could be learned. That night I sent a message back to my analyst on Earth, a man named Colin Adler who had been working interstellar policy for 11 years and who communicated almost entirely in terse, accurate sentences. The message read, I need everything we have on the Council's founding charter, original text. Every available translation, cross-referenced against current standing rules. His reply came back 6 hours later, accounting for transmission delay. That document is 4,000 years old, and has never been formally translated into any post-Century 30 admission language, because the Council has never provided one. I know, I wrote back, send what exists. Another 6 hours, then sending, also are you sleeping? I looked at my open files. There were 17 of them. I had color-coded the subsections of the Keth bill in 4 different categories. I had a running document of procedural cross-references that had grown to 31 pages. My bunk light was still on. Enough, I wrote back, which was not entirely accurate but was accurate enough. The founding charter arrived in fragments. Partial translations done by 3 different academic institutions over 4 centuries, none of them complete, none of them agreeing on certain key passages, several of them flagging sections that had been deliberately left untranslated in the official council archives. That last detail I filed very carefully. Deliberately untranslated, in a document that was still the binding legal framework for every rule the council had ever written. I started with the sections that had been translated, cross-referenced them against current standing rules, built a map of what the current rules cited versus what the founding charter actually said. There were gaps, not errors exactly, more like rooms in a house that had been quietly sealed off and painted over. You would only notice if you were looking for the original floor plan. I was looking for the original floor plan. On day 3, Collins sent another message without my asking. I showed your cross-reference document to our senior legal advisor. She said, and I am quoting directly, "This is the most aggressively organized act of legal research I have seen in 30 years of practice." She also said you should sleep. I sent back a single word, later. By day 5, I had identified the mechanism. Statute 7 of the founding charter. It had never been cited in any session in recorded council history, at least not in any session whose transcript was publicly available. It existed in the original text, referenced in 2 of the 3 partial translations, and had been quietly excluded from the standing rules index that new member species received upon admission. You had to know to look for it. You had to know what you were looking for when you found it. Any signatory species may invoke a full charter compliance review before any bill affecting biological sustainability reaches final vote. During the review period, the bill is frozen. The review cannot be waived by procedural countermotion without a unanimous founding member vote, which had not happened in the Council's entire history, because the founding members had not agreed unanimously on anything since the original signing. The Keth had helped write that clause, back when they were the emerging species, back when the old powers of that era had been trying to do to them exactly what they were now doing to 4 smaller species through 11 lines in a footnote. They had written the lock, they had forgotten they wrote it, or they had assumed no one new would ever find it. I filed the invocation form on day 6. The form number was so old that the Council's digital filing system initially returned an error message stating that the form type was not recognized. I sent a written inquiry to the administrative office. The response came back 18 hours later from a junior Vethani clerk who had apparently needed to contact 3 separate archive departments to confirm that yes, the form was real, and yes, the system would accept it, and could I please resubmit with a legacy document header. I resubmitted with the legacy document header. The system accepted it. The filing confirmation arrived with no flags, no alerts, no notifications sent to any senior council official. It sat in a processing queue managed by a clerk who was on ceremonial leave. The queue was not monitored by anyone else. I told Colin. His reply, "How long until someone notices?" My reply, "Session 44, when I stand up." 3 days of silence from his end. Then, "Yale, are you sure about this?" I looked at my 17 files. I looked at the form confirmation sitting in my inbox. I looked at footnote 19 of the Keth bill, which I had by that point memorized well enough to recite in the dark. "No," I wrote back, "but I'm doing it anyway." He did not respond to that, which, from Colin, was the same as a very long and complicated answer. I closed my files. I set an alarm. I slept for 6 hours, which was the most I had managed in 5 days, and in the morning I pressed my good jacket and ate a full breakfast and walked back to the chamber where my folding chair was waiting for me. 2 days left. I was ready. Session 44 opened at the second standard hour. The chamber was at less than half capacity. I had expected that. Final vote sessions on administrative bills rarely drew full attendance from senior delegations. The species with the most power sent junior representatives because why spend the senior delegates' time on a foregone conclusion? The Keth had sent their third-tier advocate. The Oracy had sent 2 junior delegates who had been deep in a side conversation when they walked in and had not stopped talking since. The Vethani senior delegate was present, but had the body language of someone completing a formality before a longer meeting elsewhere. The first item on the agenda was a transit corridor nomming dispute that took 40 minutes and resolved without incident. Then the presiding officer, Elder Orun of the Vethani founding delegation, called the second item. The Keth Resource Realignment Act, version 7, revision 4, final vote. I stood up. The room did not go quiet immediately. It took about 3 seconds for the people nearest to me to register what was happening and pass that registration outward through the chamber like a slow ripple. Orun looked at me with the expression of someone who has encountered a procedural situation they were not briefed on and is deciding in real time how to respond. "The chair recognizes," he said, with the particular tone of a man extending a courtesy he does not believe will require much of his time. I had practiced the pronunciation of Statute 7's invocation language from the original founding charter text for 2 days. My accent was almost certainly terrible. I said the words anyway, clearly and at a pace that did not rush or stumble, because clarity mattered more than elegance, and I knew exactly what I was saying even if the room was not yet sure they had heard it correctly. The Keth third-tier advocate turned around in his seat. His species communicated emotional state through color shifts in their outer membrane, and his had gone from their standard dark gray to something I can only describe as the color of a thunderstorm that has just realized it is indoors. "Objection," he said. "The reference statute has not been active in standing practice for over 800 standard years. Invocation requires demonstrated relevance under current procedural guidelines, Section 14, Subsection 3. He cited it smoothly. I had read Section 14, Subsection 3 11 times. Section 14, Subsection 3 applies to statutes introduced after the Charter ratification date, I said. Statute 7 predates it. Under the Charter's own hierarchy clause, original statutes are not subject to amendment procedures applied to post-ratification rules. They stand unless removed by unanimous founding member vote. The last unanimous founding member vote had been at the original signing. I did not say that out loud. I did not need to. The Keth advocate cited a second precedent. I cited back. He cited a third. I had read that one too. Orun called a 10-minute recess after the 7th exchange, which was the first time in the Council's observable history that a Tier 4 minor species delegate had held a floor argument past the second citation. In the recess corridor, the light was cooler, and the acoustics were flatter, and I could hear my own heartbeat in a way I could not in the chamber. I stood near the far wall and drank water and looked at nothing in particular. The Keth advocate crossed the corridor toward me. He did not have his legal team with him. He was alone, and without the chamber's ambient sound the color shifts in his membrane were slower, less performed. He stopped a reasonable distance away and looked at me with something I had not seen from any Keth representative in any session I had attended. "How long," he said, "did you spend preparing this?" It was not an aggressive question. It was a real one. 14 days, I said. He was quiet. The membrane shifted through a slow sequence I did not have a reference for. Not thunderstorm, not the formal gray, something in between. "No member species," he said finally, "has ever invoked that statute." "I know," I said. "It was not in your admission materials." "No." "Then how did you find it?" I looked at him for a moment. He was the third-tier advocate, not the lead. He had been sent here because this was supposed to be a formality. He had shown up expecting a vote and gotten something else entirely, and he was asking me a genuine question in an empty corridor, because something about the situation had stripped the performance out of him. "I read everything," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he went back into the chamber without another word. The recess ended. The arguments resumed. By the time Orun called the session close, the Keth bill was frozen pending a full charter compliance review that would take, at minimum, 60 standard days. The vote did not happen. I walked back to my late-arriving chair and sat down, and put my hands in my lap where no one could see them shaking. The compliance review took 83 days. I spent most of them in the archive wing of the station, a place that smelled of filtered air and something faintly metallic, where the physical records of 4,000 years of council proceedings were stored in formats ranging from crystalline data lattices to handwritten documents sealed in atmospheric preservation cases. I had requested access to the archive on day 2 of my posting, and had been told access was available to all member delegations. No one had ever specified that minor status delegations were excluded, possibly because no minor status delegation had ever asked. Colin sent me a message on day 12 of the review that said only, "3 other species have filed procedural objections to unrelated bills in the last week, using the same statute." I wrote back, "I know." I did know. Cyril had told me in his way by arriving at the archive wing on day 10 with a secondary data tablet and sitting 3 seats away from me without speaking. Vethani protocol made direct acknowledgement of an action they found significant into something they communicated through proximity instead. He sat with me for 2 hours. Then he left. The fins, as he walked out, made the movement I had seen twice before and had by then catalogued. He had not expected me. On day 40, the Keth lead advocate, the actual lead this time, not the third tier, requested a formal meeting with me through the proper tier 4 filing channels. Response time on my queries was supposed to average 30 to 90 days. His request came back approved in 6 hours. We met in a conference room that was neutral space, neither Keth nor Vethani design, just a table and chairs and the ambient hum of the station's environmental systems. He was larger than the third-tier advocate, older, and the color shifts in his membrane were controlled in the way that long practice makes controlled. You could still read them if you knew how to look. He sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table and looked at me in a way that suggested he had thought carefully about this meeting before arriving. "I want to understand something," he said, "not as a procedural matter, as a question between delegates." "Ask it," I said. "The clause you invoked," he said, "you know its origin?" "Yes." "You know who wrote it?" "Yes." He watched me. The membrane held a slow, dark color I had come to associate with Keth formality, but underneath it something moved, small, harder to name. "We wrote it to protect ourselves," he said. "I know that too," I said. "And you used it against us." I looked at him for a moment. "I used it to protect 4 species whose sustainability claims were being removed through language buried in a footnote. One of those species is mine, but the other 3 aren't." He was quiet. "Your species has been a member for 14 months, he said. 13 months and 29 days, I said. "But the charter doesn't have a residency requirement for statute invocation. Any signatory species, that's what it says." Another silence. The membrane shifted. He looked at the table for a moment and then back at me. "The bill will not pass as written," he said. "The Keth Dominion is prepared to submit a revised version that removes the contested provisions from the footnote." I waited. "In exchange," he said, "the compliance review is withdrawn and no further charter-based challenges are filed against Keth legislative items for a period of 20 standard years." I had expected something like this. I had also prepared for something like this. "The compliance review cannot be withdrawn by the invoking party alone under the statute," I said. It requires a procedural close motion that goes back to the full chamber. I can support that motion. I cannot guarantee others will. Because by that point I could not guarantee that. The three species who had filed their own objections had their own timelines and their own reasons, and their own relationship to the founding charter that was no longer mine to manage. He looked at me. "You understand what you have started," he said. "It was not hostile. It was something closer to honest." "I understand what 14 months of reading started," I said. He stood. He straightened his formal outer layer and looked at me one more time, and the membrane did something I had never seen a Keth membrane do in a formal setting. It went, for just a moment, entirely still. No performance, no diplomacy, just a long, level look from a species that had been powerful for a very long time watching something change in front of them. Then he left, and the room was quiet, and I sat at the table alone for a few minutes before I went back to the archive. 83 days, and then came Session 79. The revised Keth Bill, stripped of footnote 19 and its 11 lines, was scheduled for final vote. The chamber was at full capacity for the first time since I had arrived. Every senior delegate present, every seat filled. The Keth took their dark matter thrones and the Oracy took their coral formations, and I took my chair. The vote passed. The asteroid belt claims for all 4 emerging species were preserved. Arun closed the session with the standard procedural language he had used to close every session I had attended. Nothing in his tone was different. Nothing in the chamber's official record marked that session as anything other than a routine administrative vote. But the chamber, as it emptied, felt different. Not louder, not more celebratory. Different in the way a room feels different when the furniture has been rearranged, and you cannot immediately identify which piece moved, but you know something has. I gathered my things. I folded my notes. I looked at my chair, which had arrived late in a crate labeled supplementary furnishing, and I thought about the dock number borrowed from a maintenance bay, and the vote that had passed by 2, and 14 months of everyone in this room assuming I had nothing to say. Then I walked out into the corridor and called Colin. He picked up after one ring, which meant he had been waiting. "Well," he said. "Well," I said. A pause. Then, in the tone of a man who had spent 11 years in interstellar policy and had learned to keep his voice level for most things. "Yale, you understand this changes things." "That's the idea," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The 3 species who filed parallel objections want to request a meeting." "I know, set it up." Another pause. The Vethani senior delegate submitted a formal inquiry to the administrative office this morning, asking whether the Charter's founding language archive has a public access policy for member delegations. I stopped walking. "He submitted it himself," I said. "Senior delegate, not through a junior staffer, his personal filing signature." I stood in the corridor and looked at nothing. The station hummed around me. The light through distant viewports was the pale blue-white of starlight filtered through 3 centimeters of reinforced material. "Okay," I said finally. "Okay," Colin said, "and Yale, please sleep." "I will," I said, and this time I meant it. 6 months after Session 44, my formal posting review came through. The Council's administrative office had created a new role. It had a title that ran to 47 words in standard Galactic Common and translated into English as something roughly approximating Founding Charter Compliance and Member Equity Officer, which was either a promotion or a polite way of putting me in a room where they could watch me. Possibly both. I accepted it. My new chair was bolted to the floor. No one made an announcement about that. No memo was circulated. One morning I came into the chamber and the folding chair was gone and a fixed installation was in its place. Flush with the gallery floor, labeled with Earth's delegation marker in the same style as every other senior seat in the chamber. S. Sarrell was in the corridor when I arrived that morning. He looked at me. His fins made the movement I now knew well, the one I had catalogued on day 1 and spent weeks identifying. The Vethani expression for, I did not expect you. Sarl, I said, thank you for everything. He looked at the middle distance for a moment in the way Vethani do when they are deciding how much of an emotional response is appropriate. Then his fins moved again, something smaller, quicker. Something I had not cataloged before but understood anyway. I think it meant, I'm glad I was wrong about you. He walked away before I had to find words for it. I was grateful for that. That evening I called home for the first time in 3 weeks. My mother answered from the kitchen. I could hear the particular sounds of our house behind her, the fan above the stove, the neighbor's radio through the window, the creak of the particular floorboard just inside the back door. How is it going, she said. The big important space meetings. Mostly paperwork, I said. How is everything there? Fine, fine, your cousin got a new job. Your uncle is arguing with the landlord again. Normal things. A pause. Are you eating? Yes, Mama. Proper food, not those flat things in packets. Mostly proper food. She made a sound that meant she did not entirely believe me but would let it go. Come home soon. I'll make jollof. Soon, I said, I promise. After we hung up, I sat in my quarters for a while and did not open any files. I thought about jollof rice and the sound of the neighbor's radio and the creak of the back door, and something in my chest that had been held at a specific tension for 6 months loosened in a way I had not realized I was waiting for. Soon, but not yet. There was one more thing I needed to do first. The new session was 3 days away. A different bill this time, submitted by the Oracy Continuum, concerning atmospheric management rights over a cluster of pre-admission worlds. The language was careful and precise, and on page 287 of 391, contained a provision that quietly reclassified 3 inhabited worlds as uninhabited for developmental purposes, based on a population threshold that had been set specifically low enough to exclude the species currently living there. I had read it twice. The session opened on a clear day, station time, full attendance again, which was becoming a pattern. I took my bolted-down seat and set my files in order and waited. Across the gallery, in the back row, I could see a delegate from a species whose name I had learned to pronounce over the past 2 weeks. They had been admitted to the council 8 months ago. Their seat was a temporary installation, 2 rows up from the gallery floor, and from where I was sitting I could see that they were holding a data tablet and that the tablet was open to the Oracy bill. They were reading it the way I had read the Keth bill, with the kind of stillness that means you have stopped noticing the room around you. I watched them for a moment. Then I pulled my session notes from my file. My notes for that session were thorough, carefully cross-referenced, and included every statutory citation that would be relevant to a challenge under Statute 7 of the Founding Charter, including the correct pronunciation of the invocation language, which I had annotated phonetically in the margin. I made a second copy. I crossed the gallery during the opening procedural statements, when the room's attention was on Arun and the transit corridor dispute that opened the agenda, and I set the second copy of my notes on the railing beside the new delegate's seat without a word. They looked at the notes, then they looked at me. I did not explain anything. I went back to my seat. Because some things you do not explain. You find the clause buried in the footnote and you learn the words and you stand up in the room where no one expects you to speak and you speak anyway. And then, if you are paying attention, you look around and you see who else in that room has been reading, while everyone assumed they were just sitting quietly in a temporary chair. And you hand them the map. Session 79 had changed what the council's floor looked like. Not loudly, not with announcements, just the slow, structural shift of a room where new people had started reading the original floor plan and finding all the sealed-off doors. I had not told that delegate what the 3 words meant. The invocation, the legal weight of them, the history of who wrote them and why. I had not explained any of it. She would find it. The same way I had found it. Alone in a room with a 4,000-year-old document and enough stubbornness to read until the thing that mattered showed itself. and then she would find her own 3 words. Because that was how it worked now. Orun called the second agenda item, the Oracy bill. I opened my notes to page 1. The chamber hummed. I started reading.